This week, Levine leads us into a discussion of the concept of communication, and she tries to help us recognize the importance of being able to communicate effectively and to be aware of all the pitfalls that come into play when we attempt to communicate with other people. We think that communication is a simple process a lot of times, and simply by stating certain things in words that we understand, we believe that other people should be able to understand them as well. But that is not the case, as I'm sure most of us recognize. In fact, in the years that I worked at the children's home in Orlando, one of the things that we did was lead parent groups for the parents who are having difficulty with their adolescents. And we spent a couple of weeks talking about communication skills because oftentimes much of the crux of the problem in the household had to do with a failure to communicate effectively. And there were some basic principles of communication that we passed on to them, including the idea that you cannot not communicate. Even when we don't believe we're saying things or we're communicating things, we are non-verbally perhaps. This is one of the things that's important for us to realize is as we have been raised and grown up in our particular culture, this is a very verbal culture, a very literate culture, and we believe in the importance of words. And we have, in the course of our upbringing, been told not to use gestures and not maybe so much to express ourselves through emotions, but rather to use our words to identify what we want, what we need, what we feel. And because of this, we tend to oftentimes overlook the nonverbal cues and the importance of those kinds of things in our communication. Likewise, we're not raised to consider the possibility that people learn different rules of communication and that things such as gestures and other nonverbal types of communication can mean very, very different things from culture to culture, even from community to community. And so these are some of the things that we talk about this week in this particular chapter. Levine touches on some basics for clear communication that she believes are important for us to be able to consider before we launch into this discussion more thoroughly. For one thing, that the attitudes and the feelings of both the receiver and the sender are vitally important. This is a particularly important point here, which is it's not only what you say, but it's also how it's received. In other words, it isn't just using the right words or communicating with the proper body language, but you also need to check and make sure, we also need to check and make sure that the person receiving the message is actually receiving it the way we want it to. And that was another one of those basic principles in parenting education we used to talk about, that it's not enough just to send an effective message, but the sender is also responsible to be sure that the receiver understands what was said properly, if you really want to communicate clearly, because there is both the receiver and the sender involved in this communication. And with this in mind, an understanding of the similarities and differences between the people involved then will determine the extent to which a common understanding of communication can be relied upon. We have to be sensitive to the meaning of the differences in communicating, and more on this as this particular learning unit goes on. We must determine the capacity of the client to process verbal and nonverbal communication methods. Sometimes there are blocks to that we need to be aware of, and so we should assess that in our clients as we begin to work with them. And we should be prepared to use a variety of different kinds of communication techniques, both verbal and nonverbal, when necessary to get our meaning across. We should check to see if things need to be repeated to our clients, do things need to be emphasized more or less in our discussions, and so on. And to be very careful about the use of what we would refer to as loaded words, gestures, or symbols, to be sure that their meaning is understood and accepted. Again, as time goes on here, we'll touch on this a little bit more. Tempo of communication should be geared to the client's level, so that regardless of the amount of time you may have available for your interaction, for instance, if the client is having difficulty grasping what you're saying or not processing it as well, or having a tendency to misinterpret things, and you need to go back and double check to make sure your message was received properly, you may need to slow down what you're trying to present and not rush through communications. And then the other thing is to eliminate interference, both internal and external. And some of that may be with a particularly angry client. For instance, the internal interference would be the well of emotions that the client is experiencing. And so kind of a common thing that most people will say when dealing with an angry client is to first allow the client to express that anger in a safe way, to kind of get those emotions, those strong emotions, off his or her chest so that the client is better able to listen and receive input from you. And so that's one way of eliminating some of the internal interference in communication. Likewise, externally, if you've ever gone on home visits and you have clients that don't really want to receive you so well, they oftentimes will fall back on the television and leave the TV on, and sometimes you don't know whether they're listening to you or not. You may have to ask your client to turn the television off, take those earplugs out of her ears, take the sunglasses off, because eyes are a part of the communication process, those kinds of things. All these kinds of things are just basic little things that we should be attuned to as we work with clients. Some of you are familiar with Father Michael Oleksa. He's a priest with the Russian Orthodox Church in Alaska. He's actually from Pennsylvania originally, but he's been in Alaska for decades and mostly, at least started out mostly in the Kodiak area, since it really is very well known statewide, and is a very dynamic speaker. If you ever have an opportunity to listen to him talk about cross-cultural communication, I really encourage you to do this. He's very engaging in his style, and he makes some very good points in the course of his lectures. Now, some years ago, he recorded a series of lectures called Communicating Across Cultures at the University of Alaska Southeast. I've had the opportunity to listen to those lectures on videotape and tried to draw some of the most important elements from some of his lectures. And in his fourth lecture in that series, which is the last one, he talks about miscommunication between cultures. And he talks about some of the things that can maybe contribute to miscommunication in almost any kind of communication. And this can be generalized to any conversation and any kind of interview, but particularly in terms of cross-cultural interviews. There are many steps in the process that involves converting this idea we have in our head into words that another person can understand. First of all, with the use of words, our communication is always imperfect. And he uses the example of the word animal, that while it represents a lower creature in our lexicon, and when we talk about somebody being an animal, so to speak, euphemistically, we really are kind of saying this in a negative term. In many native cultures, animals are superior, is the spirit of animals, and so the word has very different meanings, different connotations, and thus the context of the use of that word changes the meaning of the word, even though we think we're communicating. And so that's one thing, is the words themselves have different meanings from culture to culture. The rhythm of our discussions, or our speaking also, whether we speak quickly or slowly, is very different from culture to culture as well, and is sometimes physiological in nature. That is, that sometimes just the response to things is more slow. And we may sometimes misunderstand a slowness to respond to something that we have said as a resistance, for instance, or something like that, when in fact it is more of a cultural phenomenon. Rhythm differences alone oftentimes result in miscommunication. The tones of our speaking vary from culture to culture. How high is your tone? How low is your tone? Or the pitch that is used varies very much culturally. He talked about, and this was kind of interesting really, and I won't be able to do this as well as he did, but he talks about how in many native cultures the pitch and tone of speaking tends to be rather low and flat, and tends to not have a lot of variation and just kind of stays at this level. We have children that are used to that kind of thing, and the one time that the pitch or the tone goes up is when there's some excitement or some strong emotions, and then all of a sudden the pitch and tone goes up high, and people will speak like this. So he says, then imagine children in a native village who have teachers from the outside, from the lower 48, coming up to Alaska, who are now their new teachers, and the kindergartners or first graders go into the classroom, their first day in a classroom, and their teacher says to them, "Well, good morning, children, and how are you today?" In the kind of a reassuring kind of up way that we think conveys happiness, but to them may be conveying danger and punishment. And so that's just an example, again, that he uses that's really very, very good. But the use of tones is something that's very important to keep in mind. Volume also, how loud is loud and how soft is soft, varies very much culturally and can be interpreted as domineering or passive, when really it's just different. Style. Are we polite? Are we rude? Or are we just different? It is sometimes these differences, again, isn't necessarily about rudeness. It's just about being different. The use of courtesy titles, for instance, it was interesting in the 1970s when Jimmy Carter became president. He actually started signing Jimmy to everything, and during that era, it became fashionable to really kind of drop courtesy titles, the Mr. and Mrs. or even President and at least in certain settings. And so everybody was becoming to be known by their first name. And in fact, it was very fashionable as an individual who was sending a professional letter, and my signature block, for instance, would say William Galic, LCSW, and rather than signing William Galic, LCSW above it, it would cross the signature block out and just write in Bill. That was a very fashionable thing. And you can see, in fact, that I'm still a child of this particular style of communication, because when people talk to me or write to me, I sign my correspondence Bill, and I encourage people to call me Bill. So this is a sort of a laid-back style that isn't accepted in every culture, and in many cultures is seen as very, very forward. And so this is something that we should be very careful about. The deferential style is something that is accepted and is preferred in many different cultures. And there's significance about the lack of these courtesy titles or familiarity in names and things like that varies a lot from culture to culture. Physical distance, we're sensitive to this, I think, in communication conveys different meanings from culture to culture. Some cultures are very, very comfortable with very close physical proximity in discussions that really make other people in other cultures very uncomfortable. And so this is an area that is worthy of your attention as well. And finally, different kinds of rituals, and he uses the example of saying goodbye. And the ritual when people go to leave a home, he describes this ritual that the individuals say, well, we really need to be going, or we should get going. And this gets said 4 or 5 different times finally before people are out the door. Whereas in other cultures, when somebody says, well, it's time to go, individuals just get up and leave. And the people that are from a different culture may sometimes feel as though they've said something offensive because they left so suddenly. But it is, again, a difference in communication and in how the rituals we go through in our interactions with others. We communicate a lot through how we act as well as what we say, and that's again some more of those nonverbals that we've talked about in our discussions in this particular chapter. So he wants us to realize and to remember it's not just what we say, but it's perhaps more important how we say it and how we present it in communicating across cultures. And it's very, very important to understand the rules of communication and what is normal and not normal in communication in different cultures. Varies very much from village to village and in Alaska, as well as from culture to culture around the world. Back to what Levine has to say, she talks about nonverbal communication, and she says that there are some studies that believe that really about two-thirds of what we really communicate, it comes across nonverbally, that our words really aren't as important as we tend to think that they are, and that the channels that this nonverbal communication is processed through are more affective rather than cognitive. So really, this means that we're feeling things a lot more than we're thinking about the words that are being said, and that sometimes then that can be very difficult to communicate back, particularly if you are in that part of your brain that's really focusing upon words. Nonverbal communication is continuous. That goes back to what I said early in this discussion about how you cannot not communicate. A lot of times it's very easy for contradictory messages to be sent by the worker in the communications with clients. Sometimes if you, in talking with another person, you hear what that person says, but you're not sure you're really buying what the person's saying to you. You're not sure you really accept that what that person's saying is the truth. It may be a sign to you that you are intuitively reading nonverbal cues in that other person that contradict the verbal words. And it's something to stop and look at. Is body language consistent with the verbal communication that's going on? Again, although we're trained to focus upon using words in communication, the most primitive form of conveying information from one person to another is really the nonverbal. It's what babies use very effectively. Stop and consider another factor. While this is a little bit off the subject, but being a dog lover and living with a dog, that dog doesn't say anything to me. I may talk to my dog, and we have a tendency to personalize and humanize our pets to make them into something that they really aren't, so that we do a lot of talking with them. And you've seen the cartoon where the owner is saying, something to the dog and talking to the dog, and the dog's interpreting it as blah, 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 which is really probably how it is. But nonetheless, although they do say that some dogs have vocabularies of 200 words, that doesn't mean they can speak it, but they may be able to cue into the meaning of those particular sounds. But how does a dog communicate back to you? It's with his eyes. And I have read somewhere that household pets, and particularly dogs, have become masters at conveying their needs to human beings through sort of an evolution, so to speak, through the use of their eyes and their voice, so to speak, and their body language. And so all that communication that goes on with your pet, I'm hungry, I want to go out, I want to go for a walk, I'm hurt, whatever, is all nonverbal. And that's all the communication that they have. So understand that even though we are communicating with other human beings verbally and we're getting words back in that fashion, there still remains a very powerful, this says 66% percentage of communication that is not verbal at all. It is still going on, that nonverbal stuff, no matter what we focus upon. How we interpret communication is an impact on us too. For instance, in our culture, it's not considered to be appropriate for males to be too expressive of their feelings. At least it's considered to be a sign of weakness or femininity. I'm not saying that's what it is, but that is sort of a cultural thing for us. So sometimes our deepest feelings can only be expressed non-verbally or symbolically, and it's not easy for people to tell you and talk about things sometimes. Here are some things out of the Levine text which really kind of cross back over into the material that I brought you from Father Oleksa regarding types of nonverbal communications and how they impact or complicate our communication with clients. Tone of voice, facial expression, silence in itself is a communication. Our gestures, our movements, our physical appearance while we talk, our body sounds, our demeanor, touch, environment, all those kinds of things have a way of communicating things that our words don't communicate. And as much as possible, when we're talking with another individual, we want our nonverbals to be consistent with our verbals. Sometimes the use of our terms and our words in professional language, for instance, we use a lot of words among ourselves that really have no meaning in the general population. Or we use words differently and they have other kinds of meanings professionally speaking. And so this is something to be very, very aware of as well. And the authors also talk about how the meanings of words change over time and in different contexts. And I think the example they use in the textbook is gay. The word that 40 or 50 years ago meant happy has come to mean over the course of the last several decades homosexual, and more specifically even male homosexual, I believe. And there's been some connotations lately in the youth I've noticed with my kids, or my youngest son at least, and his friends, that the term gay sometimes is used as a sort of a negative type of term that implies that something isn't good. So in any event, what words mean different things. And so one of the things that they talk about is using what we call our third ear to interpret and understand disguises in messages and nuances in messages and things like this. Not only to hear what's being said, but to process it on sort of meta levels and to consider what the meaning of those words might be. It does seem as though that gets to be pretty hard to communicate effectively when you're participating in the conversation yet also observing it at the same time. But this is a part of why I say communication isn't a simple process as we might think. And a lot of times because of that, we're not aware of the impact that our words and our gestures may have on the other person. And so we just need to be as effective as possible in speaking clearly and honestly. And this partly depends upon our selection of words and certainly also our body language. Things like humor, sarcasm, storytelling, the double entendre, the double meanings in words. These are things that the author points to also and says that sometimes they can be very powerful in communication. It's great to use humor and storytelling is something that many cultures really appreciate. But these things can also be easily misunderstood and misinterpreted as well. And so they should be used with caution. Electronic communications is introducing a whole new kind of area to be concerned about. Talked about, for instance, in the little section on etiquette about the importance of being sensitive to the fact that we don't convey emotions with our words. We don't convey whether we're being sarcastic or not. Sometimes we may say things jokingly or type things jokingly in an email or in a text communication or in a discussion board response that is meant to be joking or humorous but isn't read that way by other people and can become quite offensive. And so these are some of the basic kinds of things we need to be aware of in electronic communication. And the rules of etiquette, I think, are something that really can apply to all communications electronically. Confidentiality is a concern, of course, because of the capacity of individuals to hack into communications, and sometimes messages being forwarded to other people that they weren't intended to begin with, and those types of things. When the confidentiality, when that communication is confidential by professional means, that means in a counseling relationship or medical relationship, it takes on even more serious concerns and considerations. And there are various programs that are being implemented now that have encryption that do more, at least to assure confidentiality and communications of sensitive materials. As you work in the field, I think these programs are going to become more and more important. I would imagine eventually, ultimately, encryption is going to become sort of a given in electronic communications. It's going to be woven in somehow, I would think, to all communications. But in any way, in the interim, we're going to need to be very cautious about what we communicate electronically and do our utmost to make sure that it doesn't get out to inappropriate places. As this slide states, the internet, electronic communications, that whole world has really opened up new possibilities to be innovative in the delivery of human services, particularly for individuals who may be at a distance and can't access face-to-face services easily. For instance, such things as telecommunications becomes a very vital link to helpers in terms of medicine, sometimes in terms of counseling relationships, education. I mean, I'm working with you and talking with you and hopefully communicating things to you that improve your professional skills electronically. All of these types of services, the availability of these services are extended to entirely new audiences and at different times of the day and night than would have been available previously. Telemedicine in particular, with the cameras and individuals being able to speak with their doctor who might be 300 miles away is something to be very, very useful. I'm aware of individuals who have done counseling with individuals that are up on the North Slope, for instance, to have them join in on sessions down here in Kenai with the rest of the family, those kinds of things. So it can be used, if it's used properly and it's used carefully, it can be helpful. But there are benefits and there are risks in this type of tool in our work, and so we need to be very careful about them and use these tools with caution and care. And I was going to say to you that I think probably counseling over the internet isn't going to be as effective as a face-to-face interaction, and I believe that's probably true, and that's what this last point kind of speaks to, which is that how does this media impact the human connection between the worker and the client? This is something that we consider to be one of the most basic kinds of things in our relationship. How do we convey empathy, understanding, for instance, those kinds of things? She spends a little bit of time addressing the use of symbols in communication. The symbols can be very powerful, but again, they're oftentimes very culture bound and can be misunderstood, misinterpreted very easily, and how we decode and interpret the meaning of messages that are sent to us, first of all, by our perception. When we receive messages, and this then also means when the other person, the receiver of our sent messages, our client, for instance, receives messages, we distort the intention of messages as we receive them a lot of times because of our own personal meanings attached to the words or what we're seeing or hearing, or the context of the situation. Whether you're under stress or not sometimes causes you to have differences in how you perceive certain things that are communicated to you, whether there's an emergency or not, whether it's a pleasant day or a rough day, those kinds of things. What are our expectations? What are our biases? The context of the situation affects perceptions and the content that is sent and received. Things like, for instance, when you look at the relationship between you and the other person, is there a power dynamic in the relationship? Is there a difference in statuses or roles? Is there a group structure that requires certain kinds of communication that limits others? Those types of things. And so certainly this affects the perception as well. And finally, as we've spent quite a bit of time talking about already, the culture, the internalized perception of what is right and natural. These are the things that we are raised. So it is so much a part of the fabric of who we are, our culture, our beliefs. These are our values, our ways of seeing the world. These are so firmly entrenched in our upbringing, the very fabric of our beings, that we don't recognize them as not being the truth. And again, this is one of the reasons why I think there's a lot of misunderstandings around the world. For instance, let's just say democracy, for instance, that we assume that in our world that democracy is a good thing and that it is the preferred method of governance, and yet other parts of the world don't seem to necessarily buy into that or believe that democracy is all that great. And I think there are plenty of critics who would say that our foreign policy of spreading democracy is perhaps one of the reasons that we have as many problems as we have in our relations with other nations right now. But on a more personal basis, on a one-to-one basis with clients, I mean, I think that this is perhaps more important, so that an example being that in some Alaska Native cultures, the concept of time is different from ours. You know, some of them that are very much attuned to the seasons and things like that may mean a lot more than what the clock says. And for some individuals, when an appointment is made at 10 o'clock, that means somewhere around 10:30, something like that, you know, in around mid-morning. Whereas for an individual keeping a schedule in an office in the business world, 10 o'clock is 10 o'clock. And so when the client turns up 15 or 20 minutes later, is being seen as a resistance to participating in whatever change is trying to be brought about in the relationship, when in fact it could be a cultural difference. And so these are the kinds of things I think we need to be able to recognize and understand, that people just see the world very differently when they grow up in different cultures than our own. If we're going to empathize and we're going to respect the other individual and understand the other individual, then we have to really have an understanding and respect for the differences. And also an awareness that every culture sees itself as superior, so that everybody can look at the differences with other cultures and say, that's not as good as ours, and tell you why. It isn't just Americans that do that. Another thing to think about is the differences between interviews and discussions. And the style of communication in a discussion is going to be different perhaps from the style of communication in an interview, where interviews are not necessarily questions, but they maybe start with a question and then get a response in ways that may help the client express and understand feelings and attitudes. It doesn't necessarily have to start with a question, but a topic that's posed, for instance. And interviews tend to have a structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every interview tends to be structured that way, so that they give some continuity, that there's certain cues about when an interview is going to come to an end, so that the client can begin to pull things together and close things off, whatever. A discussion sometimes is in a larger group and is more like an informed conversation among a group of people. For instance, unlike an interview, which tends to have one person who is sort of leading the interview and is mostly posing the questions, perhaps is seen as a bit of an expert. In a discussion, it's much more democratic kind of style. It's more open in communication, and everybody brings something into this on an equal footing, more or less. And I put in here as an example teaching a class versus leading a seminar. A teacher may stand up and lecture, whereas in a seminar, a discussion-based classroom, the teacher is really looking for students in the classroom to bring things in to add to the content and material as well. So just a few quotes that are lifted from the last few paragraphs of this particular chapter to conclude this particular discussion. Once established, communication channels don't necessarily remain open. It's necessary to rework them constantly, be sensitive to the problems in communication, looking for the causes of those problems, and taking the steps that are necessary to deal with them in order to continue an effective communication process. But in the end, it's the responsibility of the worker to be aware of the dynamics of the communication that's going on, to be sensitive to the possibility of error at all times, and to be both motivated and competent to ensure that communications with helping relationships are valid and complete. It is up to us to make sure that the message that we send is the message that is received, and if we're going to be effective communicators. So that's it for this particular chapter. Hope that there's some interesting and helpful information to you here. Let me know if there's any questions. Thanks.